At noon on the 9th of July, 1940, Admiral Andrew Cunningham stood on the bridge of a battleship that was, on paper, losing this fight before it started. 90 miles ahead of him, 16 Italian destroyers, 8 cruisers, and 2 battleships were converging on his position, a force with more ships, faster ships, and land-based bombers already circling overhead. Cunningham had one battleship fast enough to keep up with him. The other 2 were falling behind, too slow to matter. He had a choice: wait for his slower ships and lose the enemy in the dark, or send his fastest battleship straight at a numerically superior fleet, alone, in daylight, with Italian aircraft already finding his range. He chose to attack. And in that decision, not in the guns, not in the armor, is the entire reason the Royal Navy came out of that afternoon still controlling the Mediterranean. To understand why this decision mattered, you have to understand what was actually at stake in the summer of 1940. Italy had entered the war on the 10th of June. Within a month, Mussolini's forces in Libya were demanding supplies, fuel, tanks, and troops to prepare an invasion of British-held Egypt. The only way to move that material was by sea, across a Mediterranean the Royal Navy still technically controlled, a control built over 2 centuries and never seriously tested by a modern rival fleet. The Regia Rarina, Italy's navy, was not a token force. It had newer battleships under construction, a large and modern cruiser fleet, and, critically, the advantage of fighting in a sea ringed by its own airfields. The Royal Navy, by contrast, was fighting a 2-ocean war with a 1-ocean navy. Ships needed in the Atlantic against Germany were also needed in the Mediterranean against Italy, and there were never enough to go around. On the 6th of July, an Italian convoy of 4 transports left Naples for Benghazi, carrying roughly 2,200 troops, 71 tanks, and over 5,000 tons of fuel. At the same time, the British had their own convoys moving between Alexandria and Malta. Both sides put their main battle fleets to sea to cover their shipping. Neither commander was planning a decisive fleet action. Both got one anyway. This was the first time in the war that British and Italian battleships would find each other in open water. Whoever came out of it looking weaker would hand the other side the psychological upper hand for the rest of the Mediterranean campaign, and Cunningham knew it. On paper, Cunningham's position on the morning of the 9th was bad, and it kept getting worse. His fleet was split into 3 groups, moving at the speed of his slowest ship. Force C, the main battle group, included the battleships Royal Sovereign and Malaya, the carrier Eagle, and 11 destroyers. Royal Sovereign was a First World War design, and by 1940 she could barely manage 18 knots. The Italian battleships bearing down on the British position could make 28. That 10-knot gap meant the Italians could choose exactly when, where, and whether to fight, and could disengage from anything they didn't like the look of any time they wanted. Then came the air attack. Through the afternoon and evening of the 8th of July, 72 Italian bombers worked over Cunningham's fleet in high-altitude formation raids. One hit landed on the cruiser HMS Gloucester's bridge, killing her captain, 6 officers, and 11 ratings in a single blast and wrecking her forward fire control. The Royal Navy had one carrier in the area, Eagle, with a handful of aging biplanes. Italy had land-based air power it could call on almost at will. And numerically, Cunningham was outmatched where it counted for a running action. The Italians could put 8 cruisers and up to 16 destroyers into the fight, screening their battleships and controlling how close the British could get. Cunningham had roughly half that in cruisers actually positioned to engage. Any cautious commander would have kept the fleet together, screened the slower ships, and accepted a long-range, inconclusive standoff, which is, in fact, almost exactly what the Italian High Command had ordered Admiral Inigo Campioni to avoid risking anything more than. Comando Supremo's standing instruction was to protect the convoy, not to gamble the fleet. Cunningham's instinct ran the opposite way. This is the part of the story the gun range statistics usually skip past. By midday on the 9th, Cunningham understood that if he waited for Royal Sovereign and Malaya to catch up, the faster Italian fleet would simply refuse contact, screen its retreat with destroyers and smoke, and vanish toward its own coastline and its own airfields, exactly the outcome Rome wanted. A fleet that runs when challenged still keeps the political and psychological advantage, even if it never takes a hit. Cunningham's answer was to break his own formation. He detached his fastest unit, the battleship Warspite, and pushed her ahead of the slower ships to close the range while there was still daylight left to do it. He was deliberately putting one battleship, escorted by cruisers and destroyers that were themselves individually outgunned by their Italian counterparts, into contact with a numerically larger enemy force before his own heavier support could arrive. This was not recklessness for its own sake. It was a calculated read of what the Italian commander could and couldn't afford to do. Campioni was operating under explicit orders to prioritize the convoy's safety over a decisive engagement. Cunningham was betting that if he forced contact fast enough and pressed hard enough, the Italian fleet, bound by its own caution, would either fight on unfavorable terms or break off entirely, and either outcome favored Britain. There was a personal dimension to the gamble, too. Cunningham had spent the weeks before the battle lobbying London for more modern ships and been told, in effect, that the Mediterranean fleet would have to do more with less. If his aging battleships couldn't outrun or outgun the Italians, the only variable left in his control was nerve. Closing distance faster than the Italians expected and forcing a decision before they could dictate the terms. By early afternoon, the plan was already working, in the sense that it was forcing exactly the kind of contact Rome had wanted to avoid. Eagle launched a strike of swordfish torpedo bombers against what her crews believed were Italian battleships. They were in fact heavy cruisers, misidentified in the confusion, and the attack failed to score a hit. It didn't matter. The Italian fleet was now committed to a fight it hadn't chosen the shape of. At 15:15, the British cruiser screen spread out ahead of Warspite, sighted the main Italian battle line. 4 minutes later, the two forces opened fire on each other at a range of roughly 26,000 yards, over 14.5 miles, near the maximum effective range for any gun in either fleet. The Italian gunnery was fast and disciplined. Their heavy cruisers found the range on the British cruiser squadron within about 3 minutes, close enough that HMS Neptune took a hit and Vice Admiral John Tovey had to pull his ships back out of the worst of it. For a few minutes, the numerically stronger Italian cruiser force was doing exactly what Cunningham had feared, dictating the terms of the fight. Then, at 15:52, Campioni committed his two battleships, Giulio Cesare and Conte de Cavour, bringing them into range against Warspite. Cesare opened fire while Cavour held back, waiting for Malaya and Royal Sovereign, still miles behind, to close in. Warspite, facing what looked like two battleships bearing down on her alone, had to split her fire between both targets without knowing Cavour was hanging back as a decoy. At roughly 1559, Warspite's gunners, using radar-assisted spotting, put a single 15-inch shell into Giulio Cesar at a range later confirmed at around 26,000 yards. At the time, the longest confirmed hit ever scored by one battleship on another in combat. It was a single hit. It didn't sink anything, but it did exactly what Cunningham's entire approach had been built to achieve. It forced the Italian commander, already under orders not to risk his fleet, to disengage rather than press a fight he could no longer control on his own terms. The Italian convoy Campione had been sent to protect reached Benghazi safely that evening, but the battle fleet built to guarantee that protection had just broken off from a numerically inferior opponent under fire. The material outcome of the Battle of Calabria looks at first glance unremarkable. No ship was sunk on either side. The British lost 2 cruisers and 2 destroyers to light damage. The Italians had 1 battleship, 1 heavy cruiser, and 1 destroyer damaged. Both fleets returned to their bases within days. By any narrow tactical scorecard, it was a draw. But judged against what Cunningham had actually risked, sending his 1 fast battleship backed by an outnumbered cruiser and destroyer screen against a larger fleet operating under its own air cover before his slower ships could arrive, the outcome validated the bet completely. He had forced an engagement the Italian High Command had explicitly tried to avoid, scored the longest-range battleship hit of the war to that point, and compelled the numerically superior fleet to break contact. Cunningham himself was characteristically blunt about the parts that hadn't gone well. He called Royal Sovereign a constant source of anxiety afterward and used the battle to press the Admiralty even harder for modern radar-equipped ships. That's worth noting because it shows this wasn't propaganda dressed up as victory. Cunningham's own after-action assessment was unsparing about his fleet's material shortcomings. The gamble had worked despite the ships, not because of them. And the wider effect showed up almost immediately in how the Mediterranean campaign unfolded afterward. For the rest of 1940, the Regia Marina, a fleet with more ships, more cruisers, and land-based air support Britain couldn't match, consistently avoided seeking out the British battle fleet for a decisive engagement. Historians differ in exactly how much of that caution traces to Calabria alone, but Italian commanders themselves, in post-war accounts, pointed to the 9th of July as the moment they recognized the British would close the range and fight even from a position of numerical disadvantage, and planned around that assumption for the rest of the campaign. Calabria set the pattern for how Cunningham would fight the entire Mediterranean War. 4 months later, at Taranto, he sent a handful of obsolete swordfish biplanes against the anchored Italian battle fleet in its own harbor, another operation where the material odds looked absurd and the outcome depended on forcing an engagement the enemy didn't want. 14 months after that, 3 of his battleships would ambush and destroy an Italian cruiser squadron at night off Cape Matapan, using exactly the same underlying instinct: close the distance before the enemy can dictate the terms and accept the risk that comes with it. None of that doctrine was obvious in July 1940. It was forged in the specific, uncomfortable decision to detach Warspite and press an attack his own force reports told him he was arguably not equipped to win outright. Naval historians have continued to debate the finer tactical details of Calabria for decades. Italian sources have argued their gunnery was, in fact, more accurate at long range across the war as a whole, and that the popular British framing of the battle overstates how outmatched Cunningham really was. That debate is legitimate and still unresolved.
What isn't disputed is that Cunningham chose to force contact when caution would have been the safer and arguably more defensible professional choice, and that his fleet, not the more numerous Italian one, dictated how the battle ended.
There's a version of this story that's just about a lucky shot at extreme range. That version misses the point. Warspite's hit on Giulio Cesare mattered because of the decision that put her in position to take it. A decision made with slower ships strung out behind, enemy bombers already finding the range, and a numerically larger fleet closing from the horizon. Cunningham didn't have better ships than his opponent. In his own words, he barely trusted the ships he had. What he had was a clear-eyed read of what his adversary's orders would force them to do under pressure, and the willingness to accept a fight on unfavorable material terms rather than concede the initiative by default. That's the pattern that runs under most of the moments this channel returns to. Superior equipment wins battles on the practice range. Wars in the real Mediterranean in July 1940 were being decided by which commander was willing to close the distance first and live with what happened next.